Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends of the institution. Good morning and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana Guidelines on Integration of Diverse Societies, one of the youngest thematic recommendations of the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. I'm Zahid Nurlazadeh, Head of Section and Senior Advisor to the High Commissioner, and I will accompany us throughout the day today. To start our deliberations, I would like to invite you to engage our imaginations for a moment. Think about a country. Think about any OSCE participating state, for example. Now, think about the ethnic, linguistic, and cultural composition of its society. Think about how diverse this society was 20 years ago, for example. And now think how diverse this society is today. In most, if not all cases, we will see that over time, the diversity of our societies is increasing. This trend is likely to continue to take shape, and the diversity of our societies will only increase. The High Commissioner on National Minorities and his staff deal with diversity governance on a daily basis. We know from our experience that if the diversity of our societies is not managed well, then this could lead to divisions, which could become a vulnerability. If, however, the diversity of our societies is given sufficient attention, is acknowledged in inclusive institutions and in inclusive policies, then this diversity becomes an asset, which will make our societies stronger, more dynamic, and more resilient. The Ljubljana Guidelines offer guidance and advice on how to attain this. Today, we will look at the past 10 years of implementing the Ljubljana Guidelines. We will take stock of some of the lessons learned, and we will try to extrapolate these lessons into the future. It is my honor to invite the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, His Excellency Kairat Abdurrahmanov, to open our conference today. High Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zahid, my dear colleague from the Office of HCNM, Honorable State Secretary, distinguished friends, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. It's an honor for me to address this forum on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana Guidelines on Integration of Diverse Societies here at beautiful Brdo Castle, where my predecessor, His Excellency Knut Vollebæk, first presented the Ljubljana Guidelines, and I'm very pleased to see Knut among us here today. First, I would like to thank our host, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia, for their superb cooperation and invaluable support in organizing this event, as well as the permanent representation of Slovenia to the OSCE. Your excellent operational support and guidance and guidelines made this event possible, and your hospitality has made us very, very warm welcome here. A special word of thanks also goes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hungary. I hope the representative of this distinguished OSCE participating state is here among us, for their generous contribution to make the event possible. I am also very grateful to those of you who have traveled from Vienna and other capitals and destinations to join us today. Let me also acknowledge and appreciate the participation of the Special Envoy of the OSCE Chair in Office, Ambassador Artur Dmachowski, who is with us here today as well. Our participants include experts, policymakers, and speakers from the variety of fields and institutions. They will provide their analysis and reflection on integration issues and diversity management practices. And I am greeting with special thanks representatives of academia and students, the young generation, those who accepted our invitation and participating in our conference. Our objective today is to review our work in the past decade, reflect on the path that led us to today, and share good practices from the OECD regions. This will help us to identify new opportunities and address future challenges in diversity management. As many of you know, 30 years ago, the position of the OECD High Commission on National Minorities was established as instrument of conflict prevention. The mandate is to provide early warning and early action in regard to national minority issues. Since then, the successive High Commissioners have worked towards addressing the short-term triggers of interethnic tensions or conflict, as well as improving stability in the 57 OECD participating states. During this time, the successive High Commissioners have issued 9 thematic guidelines and recommendations. They aim to provide policy advice to governments on national minority issues and diversity governance. In this sense, the Ljubljana document, the Ljubljana Guidelines on Integration of Diverse Societies, is my institution's most comprehensive thematic publication. The Ljubljana Guidelines state that integration is a dynamic, multi-actor process of mutual engagement that facilitates effective participation by all members of a diverse society in the economic, political, social, and cultural life, and fosters a shared and inclusive sense of belonging at national and local levels. End of quotation. This means that both the state and society share a responsibility in diversity governance. In this, the state ensures that the rights of all are respected by putting in place the conditions conducive to mutual accommodation, literally. The key takeaway from the Ljubljana Guidelines comes back to one single point, that society as a whole, not just one specific group, benefits from diversity and integration policies. That is, integration-based policies can actually help states to function better, which makes them more resilient to conflict. We anticipate that in the coming years, minority issues will continue to be instrumentalized and politicized. Therefore, it is vital to continue supporting diversity governance by investing into the integration policies. We must also share our good practices, be willing to learn from each other, and continue to engage on these issues. Speaking of staying engaged, yesterday my office organized an expert meeting to reflect on the theoretical and conceptual perspectives of the Ljubljana Guidelines 10 years after their inception. Many of the experts were the original drafters of the Ljubljana Guidelines, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them, as well as my team of the OECD HCNM, for organizing the meeting, which provided a platform to revisit the past through the lens of the present. These conversations facilitate an important dialogue to build and grow our knowledge base. Integration as a process is evolving, and it is quite dynamic. And this means that the way we work has to be constantly reassessed. I want to emphasize that good diversity governance starts with providing access to opportunities for all, including minorities. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that today's event will serve as a catalyst for us not only to reflect on and learn from the past, but also to recognize that respecting and effectively governing diversity within our society is vital for our future. For this, we have far more in common that unites us than divides us. Thank you so much for your attention, and I immediately passing the floor to our distinguished moderator, dear Zahid. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner. High Commissioner, you have mentioned that the Ljubljana guidelines were first presented in these wonderful surroundings 10 years ago. Back then, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia played a key role, also as a generous host. 10 years later, the ministry is once again graciously hosting us here. It is therefore my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Marko Štucin, State Secretary for European Affairs, International Law and the Protection of Interests of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia.
High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to the anniversary that marks 10 years since the launch of Ljubljana guidelines. Thank you very much for organizing this conference. We are only providing the weather and this nice scenery, but I really hope that this can be a very good combination that can bring results. I would like to thank you, really, for making this effort, especially in those difficult times. Our world has changed over the past year, and the combined impact of the pandemic, climate and food crisis, rising inequalities, violent conflicts, and fragmentations of the rules-based order is affecting every corner of the globe. These developments have revealed the deep structural vulnerabilities of societies and exposed profound inequalities. And all these worrying global trends call for our solidarity and a renewed commitment to multilateralism. The OSCE has Slovenia's full support in its effort to meet these challenges. Slovenia also strongly supports the work of all three OSCE autonomous institutions, which must continue their professional work for the benefits of all citizens of the region. At the same time, the participating states must continue to fulfill their commitments and thus make it possible for these institutions to provide assistance in areas that need further improvement in line with OSCE standards. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 years ago, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities issued Ljubljana guidelines on integration of diverse societies. The set of key principles included in the guidelines is useful for all those who seek to establish favorable conditions for integrated democratic societies where the human rights of all citizens are duly respected in keeping the rule of law and good governance. We see the anniversary conference as a platform to discuss the successes and the challenges encountered during the implementation of the guidelines over the past decade. It also allows us to reflect on how we could apply the guidelines in the light of current developments across the OSCE region and the emerging challenges related to integrating policies. Slovenia has a deep-rooted and long tradition of protecting the rights of minor communities. We have recently demonstrated our commitment to strengthen and increase the protection of members of national and linguistic minorities through the constitutional protection of sign language and as the first country in the European Union of the tactile language. Slovenia also devotes special attention to the situation and rights of the autochthonous Slovenian national communities in the neighboring countries and emphasizes respect for international legal acts in the protection and exercising of their rights. Ladies and gentlemen, conflicts in the OSCE region have escalated as never before in the history of the organization. The use of military force is unacceptable. We urgently need to rebuild trust and political will among the participating states. The OSCE must be able to function and fulfill its mandate despite and because of all the difficulties and challenges. We must translate our political commitments into resources the OSCE needs to implement its mandate, and we would send the right signal by finally abiding by the rules the organization set for itself almost 50 years ago. But before I conclude, let me recall Slovenia's candidacy for a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council for the 2024-2025 term. Our vision for contributing to its work includes building trust in full respect of international law and taking action to secure the future by addressing the underlying factors of threats to international peace and security. We have repeatedly demonstrated in many forums that we can bring to the table the perspective of a small country that is aware of contemporary security challenges and supports effective multilateral cooperation at the global and regional levels. At the end, ladies and gentlemen, let me again welcome you, especially those of you who traveled to our beautiful country, and I would like to wish you a very successful and productive conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. We are grateful to Poland in their capacity as the OSCE chairmanship for joining us in celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana Guidelines. I am delighted to give the floor now to His Excellency Ambassador Artur Dmowski, Special Envoy of the OSCE Chairperson in Office. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to cordially welcome you on behalf of the OSCE Chairman in Office, His Excellency Professor Zbigniew Rau, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland. I would like to thank High Commissioner for convening this important event. I am also pleased and honored to welcome my distinguished co-panelists. Shaped by both historical factors and current demographic and migratory patterns, our societies become increasingly diverse and multi-ethnic. Successful integration of all ethnic, religious, and linguistic communities into one vibrant and coherent society may be challenging, but it's a key prerequisite to develop a prosperous and democratic state, fully respecting international standards on protection and promotion of minorities and their members' rights. Together with all High Commissioner's guidelines, the Ljubljana recommendations provide an important toolkit for developing policies, strategies and programs in this direction. As the former High Commissioner Knut Wallenbeck, who issued the Ljubljana recommendations, has rightly observed, interethnic tensions and conflicts in the post-Cold War Europe were not directly related to diversity alone, but are rather a result of political decisions. Many of tensions that evolved into conflicts stem from denial of human rights and fundamental freedoms that members of minority groups should unconditionally enjoy. Indeed, even now, not everywhere in the OSCE area these rights are guaranteed. In some countries, right to education in national language, to participate in cultural events celebrating traditions and history, or to honor the memory of compatriots are denied. Systemic elimination of minority languages from the public education and attacks against civil society organizations of minorities are drastic examples of such violations. These acts, contrary to international obligations of the OSCE participating states, bring a harm to multicultural and multi-ethnic heritage in those countries and prevent them from fully developing conditions of security and friendly relations with other states. This dire situation is tragically evident in the context of the recent Russian unprovoked military aggression against Ukraine. Patterns of serious violations of rights of persons belonging to national or religious minorities committed by Russia have been already persisting since the beginning of the occupation of Crimea in 2014. Deeply concerning is, for example, the fate of the Crimean Tatars, targeted by oppressive policies of the Russian occupational administration, including systematic persecution and religious discrimination. Equally alarming is the process of forcefully imposing Russian citizenship on Ukrainian citizens in Crimea and other regions of Ukraine that temporarily remain under control of Russian troops. While national, ethnic and religious minorities are among the most vulnerable groups of population affected by the ongoing aggression against Ukraine, the war has also caused the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since the end of the World War II. Millions of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, sought refuge abroad, first of all in Poland, where 2 million remain. Their reception and integration into the Polish society has become an important task of the Polish authorities. Immediate and complex solutions for the benefit of Ukrainian refugees have been introduced to legalize their stay and to establish support mechanisms for themselves and those who provided them with accommodation. The adopted legislation guarantees access to the public healthcare system for the refugees on the same terms as for Polish citizens, as well as access to the education system for the Ukrainian children. Also, students from the universities in Ukraine were guaranteed the possibility to continue their studies in Polish universities. Ladies and gentlemen, the solutions adopted by Poland to address the situation stemming from the Russian aggression were built on existing measures concerning protection of minorities, introduced after the democratic transformation of our country in 1989. These measures help Ukrainian refugees to integrate with a new community. At the same time, in respect for their cultural and linguistic distinctiveness, they are in line with all aspects of vital importance for a minority, such as education in their mother tongue or using minority languages in administration. It also includes financing cultural activities, presence in public media, or preferences in the electoral law. Moreover, particular solutions, including the institutions of Roma School Mediator, have been implemented for members of the Roma community in Poland. The Ljubljana recommendation number 19 reminds us that minority rights are an integral part of human rights. And the recommendation number 4 clearly states, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including minority rights, enables diverse societies to fully develop in conditions of security, peace, and cooperative relations. It clearly indicates that without respecting international law and human rights, standards as those reflected in OSCE commitments, there can be no stable, peaceful, and democratic state, and that a country to be democratic has to adopt internal policies that take into account the needs of members of national minorities as well. I hope this call will be heard by all, and particularly by those who hold human rights and lives, especially now, in total disrespect. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Machovsky. One of the principles contained in the Ljubljana guidelines suggests that an effective integration process is a result of collaborative multi-stakeholder and multi-actor efforts. The UN has been and continues to be a reliable partner and an ally of the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities in dealing with national minority issues. It is therefore my pleasure to invite our next speaker, Dr. Fernande Varenne, the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, to take the floor.
Merci, Zaid. High Commissioner, Excellencies, distinguished representatives and experts, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, dobar dan, bonjour tout le monde. It's an honor to address this event marking the 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana Guidelines. To High Commissioner Abdrabmanov, I apologize for that, I'll learn eventually, and to his dedicated team at the OSCE, many thanks for the pleasure and privilege of saying a few words, a few remarks at this opening session. It took me 24 hours to get here because of 2 diverted flights, but the beauty of Slovenia, the wonderful food and wine, but most of all because of the importance of the work of the High Commissioner and its experts, and in fact, all of your presence here makes it all worthwhile. Now, I understand this session is supposed to end at 10:45, which means I have to speak for about 20 minutes, apparently. Successive High Commissioners have published 7 thematic recommendations and guidelines, providing insight and advice for states. The Hague recommendations regarding the education rights of national minorities. The Oslo recommendations regarding the linguistic rights of national minorities. The Lund recommendations on the effective participation of national minorities in public life. The guidelines on the use of minority languages in the broadcast media, and recommendations on policy on policing in multi-ethnic states, the Bolzano-Bodzan recommendations on national minorities, interstate relations, and of course, the Ljubljana guidelines on integration of diverse societies. It's important to name them because we must not forget this acquis, because despite unforeseen challenges, they are more needed today than ever before. And all of these publications are directly related to the High Commissioner's efforts to reduce tensions and prevent ethnic conflicts. Conflicts are a consequence of political choices that could have been different, that need to be different, and are frequently rooted in the denial of basic human rights. Minority rights are human rights, and this, I think, we don't sufficiently emphasize. And it is a denial of the human rights of minorities, and sometimes in the systemic exclusion and marginalization of these communities that you find very often some, not all, but some of the root causes that eventually can lead to tensions and conflict. There's a lesson here. Peace requires justice. And this is why the protection of the human rights of minorities is so closely connected to the preservation of peace and stability within and between states. Mesdames et messieurs, states are obliged to guarantee equal protection, equal opportunities for everyone, regardless of whether they are majorities or minorities. The Ljubljana guidelines were, however, perhaps a step further than previous recommendations and guidelines in that it was ambitious and groundbreaking, in that it proposed I would say, a societal model of unity through diversity, of proposing that societies should not be limited to narrow tribes of majorities or minorities, but should embrace its true and ever-increasing diversity through principles of inclusiveness, of measures and policies aimed at promoting the integration and cohesion of diverse, multi-ethnic, multilingual societies, and implying also at the same time that states protect and even embrace that diversity through policies and institutional and legal frameworks that facilitate inclusion, recognition, and mutual accommodation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that was beautiful. It is beautiful, though perhaps sometimes a bit long, perhaps a bit complex. Perhaps there is need to review, to address challenges that were perhaps unforeseen 10 years ago. Because I'm not sure we should be saying today that we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana guidelines. It may be better to say that we are marking the event. And I say marking rather than celebrating because by definition, celebrating should involve festivities. And I don't think there's a lot to rejoice about when one considers how many societies have evolved in the last 10 years or so. Extreme right-wing nationalist groups, many violent, often targeting and scapegoating minorities, even threatening the very democratic foundations of countries, are becoming more powerful, from India to the United States, and unfortunately also here in Europe. Hate speech, particularly propagated by social media, and mainly targeting and dehumanizing or scapegoating minorities, has increased to such an extent that it has been described as a tsunami of hate or a poisoning of the mind, threatening not only individuals, but whole societies. Conflicts, as we heard earlier this morning, are on the rise again around the world to the highest levels that they've been for decades. Many, not all, but many driven by claims of marginalization and exclusion of communities, often again minorities. We now have the highest levels of statelessness and internally displaced populations in human history. We don't recognize this sufficiently. And as a matter of fact, we sometimes forget that the vast majority, most of the stateless people in the world, those with no citizenship whatsoever, are members of specific minority communities, such as the Rohingya in Myanmar. Religious sentiment is rising and being instrumentalized, used, sometimes for political purposes, political and other purposes, even in secular states, with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of intolerance and prejudice rising again with attacks against religious and belief minorities in many parts of the world, including Europe. The right to education in minority languages, as we've heard earlier this morning also, are being attacked, reduced, denied, so that the principles, the recommendations that are contained in a number of the HCNM documents are disregarded in too many countries. And unfortunately, among all of this, we have the very concept of integration itself that has been subverted or misapplied in some countries, while the fundamental principles of inclusiveness and mutual accommodation are sometimes completely ignored. As was recently released in a report by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, it is rather disturbing that in the name of integration, that many measures and policies targeting the Uyghur minority in China has been put in place to show you the danger of the misapplication and the politicized instrumentalization, if you will, of the concept of integration as an empty flag, or a flag that has been subverted, removed of all of the significant content, and used for purposes of essentially assimilation. 10 years ago, when the Ljubljana guidelines were being drafted, none of this was foreseeable, even if for some there were already some clouds visible at the time. Meine Damen und Herren, and now we'll speak in German, just to test if you're awake. There's a famous saying in English, it is in the darkest moments that we must focus to see the light. This anniversary is an opportunity to focus even more on what is much needed. Perhaps this is an occasion to focus and recalibrate in sharper, more targeted ways to ensure that integration cannot be hijacked to hide what many would say is implicit assimilation and a rebranding of majoritarian nationalism. Now is the time to perhaps review how some of the most basic guidelines, such as the one which states, good and democratic governments serves the needs and interests of a state's entire population. While democracy implies majority rule in political decision-making, it also includes safeguards against the abuse of power. This is achieved by ensuring the protection and participation of minorities, and by facilitating inclusive processes of governments that involve all members of the population. End of quote. That message in the Ljubljana guidelines is perhaps today even more valid and central 10 years after they were written down. And I hope the panel of experts and their suggestions will help us find the way which seems to have been lost in this dark, stormy period. Merci. Thank you. Spasiba. Havla. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Devaran, and thank you for reminding us about one of the key principles contained in the Ljubljana guidelines, which is the value of multilingualism as well. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your valuable reflections and for contextualizing the principles contained in the Ljubljana guidelines in today's reality. Before we proceed to the keynote speech of the conference, let us once again thank our distinguished speakers with a round of applause. On 7 November 2012, almost exactly 10 years ago, the former OEC High Commissioner on National Minorities, Knut Vollebæk, presented the Ljubljana Guidelines with the words, and I quote, "All OEC participating states are multi-ethnic. Living together with people of different cultures, ethnicities, and religions is not a matter of choice. It is a fact of life. It is up to us to make the best of it." Ambassador Vollebæk, your role in initiating, issuing, and operationalizing the Ljubljana Guidelines has been invaluable. It is an honor to have you with us today. May I give you the floor to share your reflections, including to what extent we have managed over the past 10 years, in your words, to make the best of it. Please, Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Said. Mr. State Secretary, Mr. High Commissioner, dear Khairat, and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to address this conference as we mark and not celebrate, Monsieur de Varenne. Where are you? You're there, yes. I think that's very important. The 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana Guidelines on Integration of Diverse Societies. Mr. State Secretary, I vividly remember my visit to Bordeaux 10 years ago. The weather was as beautiful as today, as I recall it anyway. The presentation of the Ljubljana Guidelines was an important landmark in the history of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. And Slovenia created a conducive atmosphere for the presentation, and your government was a great host then, as you are today. So thank you again. As I read through the Ljubljana Guidelines in preparation for today's conference, and also reread the speech I delivered 10 years ago, I was struck by the continued relevance of the guidelines and the impression that the words chosen at that occasion bear a meaning also today. The guidelines are based on 20 years of experience by various high commissioners. In that respect, it is, to a certain degree, satisfying to know that they also address the challenges most of our states and societies are faced with these days. But at the same time, as some of the speakers already have mentioned, it is discouraging to realize that countries and societies have ignored or even countered some of the guidelines that might have helped creating a climate conducive to an integrated society, and in that way could have helped preventing conflicts. Mahatma Gandhi is quoted as saying, "The future depends on what you do today." These words are as relevant in our time as when Gandhi uttered them. What we do today will shape tomorrow's society. As has been mentioned, and as I said 10 years ago, and I suppose I've said it many times, all the countries in the OSCE region and beyond for that matter are ethnically diverse. Ethnic diversity is a matter of fact, not definition, as the first High Commissioner Max van der Stoel used to say. As we mark the 10th anniversary of the Ljubljana Guidelines, we also mark, as you mentioned, Kairat, the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the OSCE High Commission on National Minorities. The 1992 decision to establish the HCNM came as a consequence of the wars in the Balkans. Interethnic tension that started locally and was either not addressed or even nurtured for short-term political gains resulted in a regional war. The interethnic conflicts that erupted in Europe at the end of the Cold War were not inevitable. Rather, they were a consequence of political choices, choices that could have been different. Such conflicts are often rooted in the denial of basic rights and in systemic exclusion and alienation of communities. This is why one of the first lessons the HCNM learned about preventing conflicts is that preservation of peace and stability within and between states is inextricably linked to protection of human rights, including minority rights. However, we also learned that upholding rights is not enough. That minority rights are enshrined in the legal system of the state is not enough to prevent conflicts or to govern diversity in a democratic way. What really matters is effective implementation, which requires that adequate resources, both material and human, are made available. But even more so, it requires political will. Over the years, various high commissioners have approached governments with warnings about potential interethnic tension and advice on how to prevent conflict. Early warning has been the HCNM's mantra. Over the years, the HCNM, in accordance with the mandate of early warning and conflict prevention, has addressed the situation in the Western Balkans and in the states that were established as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all including a rich variety of ethnic groups. HCNM also called on the Central European states to take responsibility for all their citizens, regardless of ethnicity. Only that way was there hope for stability in countries that had seen their borders changing many times over the years, leaving people of different ethnicities moving from majority to minority. During my time in office, we also approached some of the Western European governments, suggesting that the tools developed for integration of societies could be useful in countries with a recent influx of immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, new minorities, as we labeled them at the time. This was not necessarily welcomed. There was a lack of political will to include the so-called new minorities in the Ljubljana Guidelines. In the introduction to the Ljubljana Guidelines, I write, and I quote myself, "The purpose of these guidelines is to provide policymakers and states representatives with guiding principles and practical advice on how to elaborate and implement policies that facilitate the integration of diverse societies. Developing and implementing integration policies should be among the priorities of all states seeking to accommodate diversity and avoid the risk of conflict developing out of increased separation and tension between groups in society, and thereby contributing to long-term peace and stability." End of quotation. The hope was that the guidelines would contribute to the elaboration and implementation of effective integration policies by participating states. We all know that integration is not an easy task. We therefore underlined that integration is a process, and the implementation has to be adjusted according to the actual situation and conditions. Since the guidelines talk about integration of societies, not an integration of someone into a society, both majorities and minorities will have to accommodate each other. Integration will not be sustainable if only minorities are expected to adjust to the majority. However, looking back over the decades since we were last in Ljubljana, many societies have developed towards more confrontation and segregation rather than integration. The fear of minorities, being traditional or new arrivals as immigrants or refugees is being exacerbated by some politicians in order to increase their short-term political support. This has led to more rift and isolation, and even tension and conflict in a society, and to minorities seeking support from outside the borders since their needs and rights are not met domestically. In my view, integration of a society is therefore also a tool to prevent interstate conflict. The Ljubljana guidelines should be seen in the context of the Bolzano-Bosen recommendations on national minorities in interstate relations. Over the years, we have seen that marginalization of minorities in one country has been used by a neighboring kin state to further deepen the hiatus between the minority and the state government, undermining the legitimate role of the national government and feeding domestic unrest, and even leading to cross-border aggression, using defense of the minority as an excuse. The political situation in the OSCE area today, as we already have heard, is more dire than when the Ljubljana guidelines were launched. We are in the midst of a terrible war that has taken thousands of lives, laid cities and villages in ruins, and driven millions to flee. I strongly believe that the OSCE, through institutions, mechanisms, and guidelines, like the Ljubljana guidelines and Bolzano-Bosen recommendations, has tools to facilitate conflict prevention if properly used. It is of utmost importance that today's war and tension should not be used to further marginalize ethnic minorities because they are perceived as a threat to state security. It is not the time to revoke citizenship, but on the contrary, to extend citizenship to those who have been deprived of citizenship for years. Minority language schools should not be closed, but strengthened through an active training in the state language in addition to the minority language. New laws that forbid use of minority language in public space should not be introduced. And even worse, one should immediately discard the idea that a multi-ethnic society is so complex to handle that an alternative instead is to adjust borders so that a minority in one country becomes part of a neighboring state where their group is a majority. In my view, this is a prescription for a catastrophe that will haunt us for years if carried out. Such border adjustments are not a solution to interethnic tension, but rather an opening for more and more unstable societies. To repeat the obvious, and which has already also been said, all participating OSCE states are multi-ethnic. Many of them have ethnic minority groups that constitute a majority on the other side of the border. Where should we draw the line? When should we say that the necessary adjustments are made? This might be a nightmare, but it can be avoided. The future depends on what we do today. 10 years ago, I said that integration is a key to facilitating security and stability both within and between states. Weak or failed integration policies allow ethnic divides to cut deep wedges into societies, thus weakening their cohesion and resilience. Based on the HCNM experience, there is a solid basis for identifying integration as essential for sustainable peace and stability. Initiating an integration policy is not merely a social or educational issue accommodating minorities and fulfilling state obligations. It is a matter of state security and should be given the priority it requires. I am very much looking forward to, as I suppose all of you are, to the upcoming panel discussion, where our experts will discuss the key principles in the Ljubljana guidelines and their relevance today, and hopefully we have great expectations to be able to identify ways to better operationalize these key guidelines. I do hope our discussion will help illuminate some of the important aspects of the Ljubljana guidelines. As the launch 10 years ago marked the starting point for an implementing process, I hope that this relaunch will spark a renewed interest in the guidelines and give room for a more informed debate on integration. I believe it is of great importance that the OSCE, as a regional security organization, plays a central role in fostering and furthering such a debate. I also hope that those of us who represent states and governments take home the message from the guidelines and use the tools that are made available to us. As with climate change, we are late in countering the negative development. However, the situation in Europe may deteriorate even further if we do not act now. We need the political will and the understanding that the future depends on what we do today. I believe that Europe's peace and stability depends on the government's willingness to pursue an active and inclusive integration policy where fundamental rights, also minority rights, are respected and adhered to. Let us, who are gathered here today, do our share in furthering this process. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Ambassador Volbeck. Your keynote speech, as well as the opening remarks by our distinguished speakers, have set the clear parameters for our further discussions, including as part of the panel after the coffee break. If I hear your interventions accurately, you also put some pressure on our experts to deliver some answers, which I think we all look forward to hearing after the break. These interventions provided us with some ample food for thought, which, according to the agenda now, we could reflect on as part of a friendly exchange and friendly conversation over a cup of tea or over a cup of coffee, which I hope you all enjoy. Thank you. Let's see. 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. Go ahead.
He has that. I'm going to ask you.
mics for the stage and one for the videos.
Yeah, but you're going to take who's going to carry the mic to the audience here? Okay, so she needs that mic. Okay, when he comes back, I'll make sure she has it.
Welcome back. Yesterday, in preparation for today's conference, we sat together with a group of prominent experts, policymakers and practitioners who work on matters related to national minorities, integration of diverse societies, interethnic relations. And together we have reflected on the Ljubljana guidelines from a theoretical and conceptual perspectives and examined different approaches, policy solutions and lessons learned, as we have identified earlier today. Now, to share the conclusions and recommendations from this expert meeting, I would like to invite Dr. Vela Patay, Director of the European Center for Minority Issues.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you just heard, this is breaking news from yesterday, and that's why you will forgive me my use of a laptop instead of a conventional printed out set of remarks. But be that as it may, let me begin this seminar, or the summary, with a word of gratitude to the High Commissioner and his staff for enabling yesterday's very rich half day of exchange and consultation. I want to reiterate the words that Zahi just said and stress that this expert group was really excellently comprised by including individuals who were at the inception of the guidelines 10 years ago, also practitioners who've been implementing the guidelines over the last decade, and of course academics like me who just try to think things a bit deeper and make deeper sense of them. This diverse set of perspectives allows us to, and did allow us to engage, as I said, in a very rich and meaningful discussion of what the Ljubljana guidelines were meant to achieve and how they've been received in the meantime, and now what the challenges are for the future. So I will structure my remarks in the next 15 minutes across these three temporal perspectives, a little bit about origins, a little bit about evolution, and lastly, something about the future. So regarding origins, it was noted fairly early during our discussion in the expert group that the Ljubljana guidelines have, by comparison, taken on the broadest of all possible notions within the scope of minority affairs, namely integration. This explains not only why the guidelines are longer than all of the other HCNM documents, but also how they attempt to put forth a new vision for dealing with minority issues. So firstly, to speak to that point, there is in the guidelines, of course, an explicit definition of what an integrated society might or should look like. This definition has already been quoted, but let me remind you that, again, integration in the scope of the guidelines is a dynamic and multi-actor process of mutual engagement that facilitates effective participation by all members of a diverse society in the economic, social, political, and cultural life, and fosters a shared and inclusive sense of belonging at national and local levels. So note that there are two components here. Mutual engagement leading to an outcome, which is shared and inclusive sense of belonging. Note also that within the Ljubljana guidelines, there is no explicit discussion of nation states or of how minorities might be accommodated within some kind of ethnic nation building project. Rather, there is an explicit stress on mutual engagement and a process that, quote, can lead to changes in majority and minority cultures, unquote. So while these different quotations have all been taken from the introductory text of the guidelines, these same principles are also underscored in individual points of the guidelines, namely point 12 that says, quote, targeted policies should be developed and implemented that address both minorities and majorities. And, for example, point 10, all members of society share the duties of obeying the laws and the responsibilities of contributing to society and to the integration of society. So it's important to remember that the origins of the Ljubljana guidelines lie in a kind of Copernican revolution that was meant to shift the terms of debate from specific groups and sort of group-based thinking to one of society as a whole, with individuals and mutual accommodation at the center. Now, arguably, as we've heard already many times this morning, this imperative has only grown, with the nature of diversity having been expanded even more in the last 10 years. Many of you have probably heard even of the notion of super diversity that was coined some years ago. And in this respect, looking back at the origins of the guidelines, we can really see that they were a pathfinder in that they speak of the integration of diverse societies and thereby hint at the fact that actually diversity management is the overarching question that we need to address, even if we sometimes recognize individual different minority groups or types of minority groups or new immigrant communities or even displaced populations. Moreover, our expert meeting stressed the fact that diversity management across these many types of groups is now at many different levels, the European, the national, and the local. So I think it's very helpful to imagine a kind of matrix where we have different kinds of minority groups, perhaps on the horizontal axis and on the vertical axis, the levels at which policy making can take place, local, national, and European. Already we have a 9-box matrix. Social scientists love matrices, but they allow us to think, well, what's in one box? What can I do? What should be done in one box as opposed to the other? And it actually helps build a roadmap for future activity. Now, all of this is actually captured in the guidelines, and that is why they are often critiqued, paradoxically enough, for their length and seeming abstruseness. After all, we have in the guidelines a whole series of legal principles of non-discrimination. We have political mechanisms of participation. We have educational issues of language instruction. We even have symbolic questions of street signs. But this is where we are at, actually, and the guidelines need to be seen in this light. These issues are not simple. They have only grown in complexity, and therefore we need to pay attention to them now and in the future. We are really talking about nothing less than the core cohesion, peace, and prosperity of our societies. So we are obliged to take all of those aspects seriously and see them in their entirety. So now a little bit about the evolution of the guidelines and what's happened since. On this score, of course, we as experts, as we've already heard, were unfortunately less than optimistic, in that not only have there been far too few occasions of follow-up dialogue with political authorities and civil society organizations and other stakeholders about the guidelines, but on the contrary, we have also seen even a reversal of some of the principles contained in the guidelines. This claim about a reversal involves actually 3 dimensions, as we discussed yesterday. First, this begins with backsliding on the principle of good and democratic governance that is enshrined actually also in the guidelines, already in point 2. So it's a core bedrock element of the guidelines to stress the importance of good and democratic governance within the framework of integrating diverse societies. The expert group noted that making further progress on implementing the guidelines is extremely difficult where democratic governance itself is in question. There is a fundamental will and stance in favor of inclusiveness that comes only from democratic governance, and where such governance does not obtain, one of the core preconditions for mutual accommodation and the development of a shared sense of belonging is also lacking. So here we started at a very fundamental point. Secondly, there's also been a decreasing willingness among international organizations that are actually called upon to shepherd these principles to really speak up on these matters. Since 10 years ago, there have been more and more efforts by states to hide behind doctrines of national sovereignty or of margins of appreciation that increasingly make a laughingstock out of how some of these institutions should work. Thirdly, the expert group noted how the notion of integration itself has sometimes been perverted or misinterpreted to mean implicitly assimilationist or nation-state building practices. This means that, as we've heard already from Mr. de Varenne, that efforts to shut down minority schools in the name of integration or to continue with a one-sided notion of integration, meaning something is simply folded into something else, really undercut the actual spirit of integration embodied in the guidelines and in the quotation that I read out to you earlier. And yet all of these guidelines and other HCNM documents are part of the political commitment of the participating states of the OSCE. But not all has been bad in terms of evolution since 2012. In line with the guidelines principles, we can also speak about a greater mainstreaming of the notion of society-wide integration based on mutual accommodation. We can begin by noting again the fact that minority rights are human rights, has been already stressed, and therefore there is a broader inclusive and humanitarian idea that underlies the guidelines. We are engaged and we are engaging in integration and in minority issues, not because we want to do some kind of special favor for a subordinate group within our population. Rather, we are doing this because human rights themselves prescribe the kind of inclusiveness that the guidelines' understanding of integration espouses. So there is actually a very tight connection to the broader notion of integration contained within the guidelines and the principles of human rights overall. Additionally, there is a greater understanding that this society-wide integration is essential if we are to deal with the super diversity of our time. This is the reality of our age. And I think that this cannot simply be blocked through some reversion to pure national values or an insistence that everyone be pushed into a single box. We have to stop thinking really in terms of single homogeneous groups. As one expert put it, we no longer live in a layered cake where groups are separate and stacked upon each other. We live actually in a marble cake, and which I actually prefer to layered cakes. My wife makes a very good one, where the different batters have actually flown into one another. Right? So this is, I think, an extremely important metaphor to reflect on. Of course, there is fear about what will be, quote unquote, lost in the mutual accommodation process. If we take it seriously, if we talk about changes in majority cultures, then it's clear that perhaps things will change also in majority societies. And so when the guidelines say that integration can lead to changes in majority and minority cultures, this is a very bold statement. It is an uncomfortable statement, actually, for those who would like to see, a nation-state project and are primarily interested in safeguarding only one singular, pristine culture and heritage within a single territory. However, as we've noted, all cultures are in change, both majority and minority. So mutual accommodation is actually the new norm, and already 10 years ago through the guidelines. So let me just add a few words about the future, and allow me to address this dimension of our expert discussion with 3 points. The first was whether we are in a position to develop more systematic indicators for the guidelines themselves. We know that the world of social science is awash of indices and data sets that academics like myself help to produce, often in collaboration with NGOs and international organizations. In the given instance, there is no immediate set of indicators that might cover all of the aspects of the Ljubljana guidelines. The HCNM office did undertake some preliminary work a couple years ago by commissioning a review of existing indices and data sets on minority issues. However, as I'm sure many of you know, there is no single source for information on national minorities in particular, which constitute the core of the HCNM's work. Rather, most of the existing indices and databases are based on an examination and assessment of the rights of new immigrant and migrant communities. So, while many of these analytical categories, right, if we're looking at political rights, if we're looking at non-discrimination, if we're looking at cultural rights, socioeconomic participation, they overlap across different types of minorities. So again, we're back to the overarching idea of society-led integration. It is still the case that most of these data sets do not incorporate all of the groups at once. And so this remains, for the future, one of the tasks, namely a more concerted effort to map out a monitoring process for the guidelines. A second dimension of the future for the guidelines involves looking at emerging spheres, perhaps not covered by the guidelines at the time. What are the new issues that are on the horizon? One realm identified quite early in the expert discussion was the place of religious diversity. This is addressed only cursorily by the guidelines, and to be sure, it is not entirely evident that we now need a separate set of recommendations on religious diversity in the OSCE, and it is also a question that is addressed by other international organizations, but the issue does need to come in some way onto the agenda of the Ljubljana guidelines. Otherwise, again, this notion of diverse societies will be incomplete. And it will not be completely in tune with the reality of our age. Additionally, there are a couple concrete suggestions to deepen some of the individual dimensions of the guidelines. For example, political participation could be enhanced by a more concerted look at non-territorial autonomy models, especially for dispersed minority groups. Furthermore, the guidelines section on symbols does not encompass a discussion of historical memory or contested memories. This is an area that the HCNM has worked on previously, and in the given context right now, in our given moment, it would appear even more imperative that this issue be taken up. And so those are three sort of new dimensions of the guidelines that could be taken up: religion, non-territorial autonomy, and historical memory, to carry the subsections further. And finally, a couple very practical suggestions that policymakers and responsible authorities could begin thinking about as you leave this beautiful room and this beautiful environment. Firstly, at a very simple level, right, if a real commitment to the Ljubljana guidelines involves having analytical administrative capacity to see diversity, if not super diversity, in its entire scope. This means quite simply that governments can think about combining, or better, integrating, offices for national minorities with other government sections dealing with immigrant communities or other aspects of diversity management. Right? There should not be silos on this issue in government. Nor should minority issues be simply delegated or often relegated to a single individual who is suddenly made responsible for somehow solving everything related to diversity. The notion of diversity management needs to be mainstreamed more seriously across government, since it really does cut across so many policy issues: housing, employment, urban development, cultural affairs, regional development, and even yesterday we had a very interesting discussion about military affairs and security affairs, if not in the scope of minority members in the armed forces. Secondly, the language also matters. So that's another takeaway. It matters if we call minorities somehow a problem, if we somehow indicate that they are a challenge. This means that we are calling people a problem. This means that we are rejecting other human beings. We are not taking the time to discover the value of others. We are not adequately addressing the diversity of our own societies. To be sure, there is heated debate today in many societies about politically correct language, but nuance, connotation, messaging, these all exist in language and in the words that we say and use and employ. So we have to harness this, i.e. language, to our advantage, and not only allow it to become a tool for antagonism and division. Mr. High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, this was a short summary of the very rich and insightful discussions that we had yesterday in the expert group yesterday. I hope we'll have an opportunity to take these thoughts forward with you and the staff and others at future meetings. I thank you very sincerely for your kind invitation, consideration, and attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patay. Yesterday we've had several hours of fascinating discussions, and Dr. Patay, I'd like to thank you for being able to condense all of this knowledge into such a comprehensive summary. I also would like to thank you for, I said we had interesting discussions, but some parts of these discussions have also been quite passionate, because all of us, we care about this topic so much. And Dr. Patay, I also would like to thank you for framing these passionate conversations into disciplined and dispassionate academic frameworks, which we will reflect on some elements of in the discussion now. Thank you very much. On this note, let's proceed to the panel discussion. As we identified, we will reflect on some of the principles contained in the Ljubljana guidelines. We will try to extract some lessons learned. And of course, as a conflict prevention institution, it is our duty to think in categories of forecasts, in categories of scenarios, which is why we will also try to extrapolate some of the lessons into future action points for us to take on board as the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, but also for the OSCE participating states as well. This is an ambitious task for which we have 90 minutes, but we are in good hands of our excellent experts that are here today. You have their detailed biographies in your folders, but let me briefly introduce them to you. Dr. Jennifer Jackson-Priest, Associate Professor of Nationalism at the European Institute and Department of International Relations, London School of Economics. Dr. Petra Rotter, Professor of International Relations at the University of Ljubljana and member and a former president of the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities of the Council of Europe. Mr. Robert Alagiozowski, National Coordinator for Interculturalism, One Society, Development of Culture and Interagency Cooperation, the Government of the Republic of North Macedonia. Ms. Nadira Jusubekova, Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Education and Science of the Kyrgyz Republic. Dr. Vida Montvidaite, Director of the Department of National Minorities under the Government of the Republic of Lithuania. And Dr. Francesco Palermo, Professor of Comparative Public Law at the University of Verona and Head of the Institute for Comparative Federalism, URAC Research. Let us give our distinguished experts a very warm welcome. Dr. Jackson-Priest, if we can start with you, and one of the questions that cut across our discussion yesterday in the expert meeting, but also was very much present in the opening remarks, is the notion, which is a fundamental principle that is contained in the Ljubljana guidelines. It is, and it is a principle that we convey to the OSCE participating states as well as the advice of the High Commissioner. It is the integration of multi-ethnic societies rather than integration of minorities into societies. How do you see the evolution of this notion in the past 10 years in the academic and political discourse, and what trends do you see in this regard?
Not sure this is where, oh yes, there it goes. Thank you very much, Zahid, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation. I think beginning our discussion of the content of the guidelines focused on this point is fundamentally important because this marks a watershed departure, really, from earlier understandings of what was involved in integration. And we can see the continued evolution of that new way of thinking in the past 10 years. I'm going to begin by acknowledging what is not integration, which is really the innovation that we see within the Ljubljana guidelines. What is not integration is, of course, an understanding of separation between communities, which sets up possibilities for fragmentation and also for marginalization. And with that, from a conflict prevention mandate, we have, of course, the real problematique of a possibility for grievances to grow and to potentially fuel conflicts going forward. Equally, integration is not assimilation. It is not a unidirectional process in which all of the obligation for change is put upon the minority, who are expected over time, in effect, to disappear within the majority. And again, this is also a scenario which sets up possibilities for resentment and for grievance, and therefore also for conflict. So this is an important starting point for the Ljubljana guidelines, which instead envisions a process, and we've heard this term before, and it is, to my mind, the most important concept within the entire guidelines, the emphasis on mutual accommodation. And that is a very different presumption from either separation or assimilation, because it acknowledges that in society, all members of society must change to accommodate one another, to make space for one another. How do we do that? Well, I'm sure our colleagues here will say more about how we do that, but in its essence, we do that by recognizing that we are all human beings, we have the same human rights, we have the same basic desires for the future, for peace and prosperity for our children, and the way we achieve that, of course, is to recognize and respect our differences and accommodate one another, and that creates a dynamic society going forward, and also therefore sets the foundations for a resilient society that can cope with unexpected changes, and obviously we've seen a lot of them in the last 10 years. This maps very nicely onto discussions within the theoretical literature, where we have seen increasingly an interest in recognizing the diversification of diversity. This is not simply a discussion which focuses exclusively on ethnicity, but also has to acknowledge many and indeed intersectional differences. We need to think, for instance, about how women and youth who are members of minorities may be differently impacted by circumstances and may require somewhat different policies in order to be able to encourage their full social, economic, and political participation, which obviously is the very foundation of their integration. So that acknowledgement that context matters, both individual context, but also, of course, policy context, thinking about the ways in which different levels of government need to come together to coordinate their integration strategies, local, regional, national, and indeed, of course, international cooperation as well. I've only been given 5 minutes. I rather suspect I'm coming up to the limit of my time. So I think I will pause then and pass on to my colleagues, who I'm sure will add further depth to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Please, you've alluded to some of the ingredients that will indeed come back as we reflect on the principles in the Ljubljana guidelines. One of the points that you referred to was the intersectionality, and this is indeed one of the areas that we deliberate on as the Office of the High Commissioner. We're looking at the intersections between national minorities and gender, because some of those vulnerabilities tend to amplify themselves. This is one of the directions in which we shape our internal thinking as well. I would like to turn to you, Dr. Rotter. The Ljubljana guidelines outline principles of diversity governance in several policy areas. If we look at the implementation of the Ljubljana guidelines over the past 10 years, what are some of the lessons learned that you see in the implementation process specifically?
Thank you, Zahid, for the question. In a way, I think one cannot really discuss lessons without really merging them with the challenges. And times are challenging, as we've been hearing since the morning, and as we are feeling the challenges in everyday life. So, of course, all these policy areas, anti-discrimination, full effective equality, citizenship, effective participation, language, education, security and law enforcement, access to justice, media, and diversity in symbols and their use in public domain. All of these policy areas, we have seen several results, several attempts to sort of somehow redesign or design policies that would contribute to societal integration. But I think over the past 10 years, for sure, we can come, and probably we all will come to the conclusion that overall the glass is half empty. There have been many challenges that the governments, societies, individuals, and communities have been facing on the ground. I would like to focus perhaps on the 5 lessons/challenges that we have been able to observe, not perhaps just in the past 10 years, but over a little bit of a longer period of time, since we have seen the development of this new regime on diversity management within Europe, but also globally within the UN. So the first challenge, and then I'll try to draw a lesson out of it, is the perception, which is something we heard before, that diversity is still largely viewed as a problem rather than an asset. We tend to see many attempts across the region that minorities are not viewed as an integral and valued part of our diverse societies, but that they are viewed as a problem. And of course, by implication, if you view someone as a problem, then you expect the problem to be solved. And all the attention, unlike what Jennifer was saying before, that the attention needs to be really coming from all segments of a society, all attention then focuses on the need and the expectation of minorities, persons belonging to them, to assimilate, to change, to respect us, to integrate, rather than thinking about integration of society. And of course, by implication, the dominant majorities are almost excused of any responsibility for diversity management, unlike what the Ljubljana guidelines so nicely and usefully summarize. So when one looks at the challenge of diversity, minorities being viewed as a problem rather than an integral part of diverse societies, being viewed as something that belongs to possibly other states, that's something that is temporary, so minorities are here but to go away. Many new sort of minorities are viewed in such a way. We heard disturbing issues about possible solutions from the previous High Commissioner, Ambassador Wollebeck. You mentioned that the problem is to be solved also by some policy proposals of changing of territories, shifting borders, as if we have learned nothing from history following the First World War and some other instances. So what is the lesson from this? The major lesson is that language matters, that our minorities are minorities living within our societies, that they are an integral part of our societies. And the second lesson is that we should all work to change this perception in language and in practice that minorities are a problem as such. They're not a problem. We are all facing different types of problems. And so if there is one sort of starting issue that we should be thinking about is this perception and the language. Then the second challenge, and possibly a lesson, the challenge being that when you look at how diversity is being addressed, how minority rights are being implemented, we still see the problem of unwillingness of many policymakers, many individuals, also many communities, to think about intra-group diversity, to think about multiple identities of individuals, and to think about the dynamic nature of identities that are situational. We all have several identities, and in different circumstances, one or several of our identities may be more exposed. And we all are part of communities, be it ethnic, religious, or just sort of gender communities or professional communities. And all these communities are diverse. But we see in practice that there is this inability, I would also call it sometimes unwillingness, to think about intra-group diversity. As Jennifer mentioned, the issue of intersectionality that needs to be taken on board. So, of course, the lesson being is that we should really try to grasp, understand, and accept this intra-community diversity. So societies are much more diverse than being composed of one or more majority nations and one or more national minorities. But diversity, there is much more to it in our societies. Then the third challenge and a lesson has to do with the planning, with the process of planning integration policies. We see that in many cases, there is no intentional attention being devoted to policy planning in line with the Ljubljana guidelines and many other documents that exist and have been produced by several international institutions, by states, of course, participating or being members of these institutions. The inability or unwillingness to really think and plan for integration policies start with the lack of proper data collection. Many states somehow collect the data in a statistical way rather than through what is sometimes considered as an old-fashioned way of exercising national census. But a national census done in an old-fashioned way allows individuals to really express their identities, and it offers an opportunity to policymakers to really know what diversity there exists in a society, and by implication, what are the possible needs that one needs to focus on. Then, of course, when one thinks about the data, it's not just the basic data collection that is often missing, but it's also the data collection on effective equality. Does it matter if you are of a certain ethnicity, of a certain gender, of a certain socioeconomic background, what your chances are in life? In other words, do you stand a better chance to get education, to be employed, to lead a normal life we all want, if you belong or if you self-identify with a particular community in a particular way, as opposed to being person belonging to other communities? Then, of course, planning of policies requires participation. And what we have seen, and here I think is an important lesson that can be learned, in addition to the need to collect good, comprehensive data on diversity, on effects of policies, but also the planning and the policy making requires effective participation of everyone. And if we take what Jennifer was saying and what I mentioned before, the intra-community diversity seriously, and if we understand it the way it should be understood, then it means that one person representing the entire community will not be enough for effective policy making. When policies are being discussed, a diverse group of interlocutors need to be consulted. The civil societies, the women, the youth, the elderly have different needs than the youth belonging to minorities or any other communities. So all of these issues need to be taken on board during the policy-making process. Then the fourth one, diversity management through minority rights should be, as we also heard before, should be mainstreamed, done in line with the Ljubljana guidelines. The Ljubljana guidelines are probably not the shortest of all the documents, but managing diversity is a complex process. And I think we have all read them after some time. And yesterday, as it was said, we sort of agreed that they still hold such a value. And yes, it takes time to comprehend all of the measures. But I think what the message or the lesson should be really in front of our heads when we think about how diversity could be managed through minority rights is that it brings, or it should bring about, effects at 3 levels simultaneously. So any access to minority rights or diversity management more broadly is to be achieved with a view of ensuring effective equality, prevention of discrimination, equal opportunities to everyone at the level of individuals. So we as human beings should have equal opportunities regardless of how we self-identify, who we belong to, which community, or how diverse we are within our own community. Secondly, at the level of societies, anything that happens should be evaluated and done with a view to producing integrated, coherent societies that are inclusive. And then finally, of course, at the level of the international community, peace and stability should somehow follow from the developments if we achieve them at the level of individuals and societies. So all of these 3 things we should keep in mind when we deal with diversity. And there is, of course, potential for that. Learning 2 languages for everyone is something that can be done. This is not impossible. Thinking or learning about diversity by everyone, not just by persons belonging to minorities. Being aware of the gender perspective, of the age perspective, is something that should be done for everyone. Everyone will benefit. We have learned from sort of feminist studies that women's rights benefit not just women, they benefit entire societies. The same here, only that diversity in this sense is to be understood in a more broader sense. And finally, my 5th point regarding actors. There is often this expectation that it should be them who should start the process, or that it is them that should sort of somehow change. I sort of strongly believe in this sort of saying, be the change you want to see. Let's start with ourselves. Let's take on the responsibility that we have as policymakers, as members of society, as members of individual communities, as scholars, as students, as sort of like depending on our roles that we have, depending on our position. And in this context, I would like to stress the importance of also sort of engaging within and with international institutions and with experts. We as experts are often blamed to convey the difficult messages, but what we do is really we study, we try to offer informed advice, we try to show the mirror, but we are not in the mirror. And we are showing the mirror so that hopefully we will all benefit from that. So what we see today, and one of the 5 lessons I wanted to sort of emphasize, is that diversity management really requires everyone to have a genuine attempt and ability and responsibility to participate in this process. It is simply not enough to expect from someone else and to sort of look at those that are lagging behind. No, let's be the change we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rotter, for this inspirational contribution, but also very analytical and tangible. I know that the advisors of the High Commissioner are profoundly grateful for such clear direction in which we as an office will also continue thinking about. You mentioned one area which is fundamental for integration of diverse societies, which is a thorough policy planning. This offers a nice bridge towards our next speaker, Mr. Alogyozovsky, who I will ask to reflect on the experience of North Macedonia, specifically on this question. In general, if we zoom out, the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities has been effectively cooperating with the government of North Macedonia since the very beginning. The first High Commissioner, Honorable Max van der Stoel, was very much and very actively engaged in some of the issues that we're discussing today. High Commissioner Kairat Abdrahmanov is also providing support to the government of North Macedonia, specifically when it comes to One Society for All strategy, which is a state strategy that strengthens social cohesion in North Macedonia. So, Mr. Alogyozovsky, I wanted to ask you, when you were planning this strategy, when you were deliberating on some of the elements of the strategy, and I know that you're familiar with the Ljubljana guidelines, what were the elements that you were thinking to yourself, okay, this is exactly the elements that we need to have in our strategy in North Macedonia specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Zahid, for the introduction and question. Well, the multicultural or the diversity management accommodation in North Macedonia has a longer history, and after we have had an ethnic conflict of a smaller scale in 2001, there was the Ohrid Framework Agreement in which High Commissioner's office was also participating and helping a lot, so that this Ohrid Framework Agreement actually already proscribed a lot of institutions, measures, and ways how to, in a way, improve the minority rights in North Macedonia and how to improve the intercultural dialogue. But what happened afterwards was actually that a lot of what was written there was not accomplished, especially the institutions and the policies were not active. So that when Ljubljana guidelines came in 2012, we, the activists, the people, the experts who were speaking about the need for integration policy and social inclusion policy actually get, not to say a holy book, but really something that gave relevance to our work. So we get inspired by the guidelines, and of course then we incorporate them because we share the same belief in our mission and vision statements and our daily activities. And you know, speaking about 2012, the introductory words by High Commissioner Vollebeck, you know, look like prediction for what was then said in 2016 by a survey which showed that according to the citizens poll, the distrust and discriminations are the two main issues that they feel in the country. So although you have like prescribed policy, then you actually end up in divided society with mistrust among communities and with actually fragmentation of the state. So that also, let's say, the advisory committee of the framework agreement in their fourth report in 2016 also noticed all these maladies. And one of their recommendations is that the country and the government should be immediately discouraged for further ethno-nationalist policies and systematically care about social inclusion policies. So in a way, not only that we believed, but we were obliged by international reports and recommendation to implement the guidelines. So that in this aspect, many of Ljubljana guidelines were included in this strategy. So in order to build an intercultural and interactive strategy, we let's say, forged the term one society. So one society means that regardless to the different rights that we all strive for, at the end we must be one and not two, not three, not parallel societies. And that's how we come with this. Then in the whole process, we took much advices of what was already written in the guidelines. So so I was nominated as part of Prime Minister cabinet to take care of the strategy, first creation and then the implementation, although we also have different agencies, ministries and bodies that took care. But to point out that the centrality is the strongest political will that comes from, let's say, the mightiest person in the system. But then, of course, we also took the advice to make a participatory process. So we invited through public call NGO activists dealing in minority rights, but also dealing with intercultural policies, and more than 150 NGOs actually applied and showed interest to participate in the process. So because of that, the process lasted for a year and a half, and it was always delaying our government wishes to push more, to push forward. But that's how the feeling of belonging among the different actors, and then, let's say, the popularity of the strategy was due to this participatory process, because the representatives on big panels and separated in different clusters were shaping the objectives, the results that were expected, and at the end even the action plan. And also what proved good is that the good collaboration also continued with the High Commissioner Office, with OECD Mission Office in Skopje, with international experts, so that we really built this multi-level trust among the different stakeholders. Then it was obvious that this strategy, so again, another advice and recommendation that we follow was to make a multi-actor and multi-stake policy. So we went into 6 different areas: youth, education, culture, media, the legal system, and then we also designed an overall social cohesion area, like for all those cross-cutting issues. And we designed in these different fields, different very concrete actions of how that we can improve the overall participation of the minorities in our country. We call them communities, and of course the relation among themselves. So let's say in the education, we revised the textbook, we revised all the stereotypes, gender stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes, class stereotypes. Then we issued the criteria for intercultural competencies. We trained also, we insisted very much on training the teachers, but also we had implemented the mixed interethnic classes, so that some special or common subjects were taught together in a vast number of of schools. So that we went in different areas. Another point which is also clearly in the guidelines is that we insisted on the openness and fluidity of minorities, of communities, of the groups, because when you are dealing with representatives, the first they are rather closed. So even among themselves, the representation is quite marginalizing others. So we insisted that there should be, let's say, help, support, grants for rural women in the areas, that there should be regional inclusive funds going to some villages or some public infrastructure which was neglected, usually in the municipalities, so that insistence that the participation and representation should be widened was one of the, so I wouldn't say tense, but still a point to be reached. And also mentioning the census, we insisted that the question in the census should be open, so that they should also notice the fluidity and the change of the attitudes to some of the communities, because the smaller communities, they are also in conflict, and usually they are accusing among each other in a conspiracy theory that somebody is pressuring someone to change. Of course there are cases like that, but sometimes people decide that they belong to this community or to that community as well, and it is their right. It should not be proscribed. So that the Ljubljana guidelines inspired us a lot. Of course, there are a lot of challenges, this crisis that we went in, but what is important is that after 2 years, we produce 2 annual reports, and we are now, this year, planning to get into next strategic cycle. So in countries in transition, in turbulent areas, to come to 2 strategic cycles is already a sign of continuity and stability of the situation. And there are results. So if you see the Freedom House report, there is only 1 sentence on interethnic relation. They say it's obvious that in the previous year there was no interethnic cases or violence erected. So that already shows the result we have made. Also, the fifth report of the Framework Convention Advisory Committee is much better than the one of the fourth one. Well, there are implementation challenges, but very often actually they come to what you call in the guidelines the structural principles. So the good governance, the weakness of state in general, sometimes the spoils system, the clientelistic system is also affecting the specific policy. So you shouldn't attribute failure to do something to the fact that somebody committed to better manage the diversity has not done the work because he is xenophobe or I don't know what, but this is the general lack of professional capacities or professional culture and things like that. We hope that, we hope that in the next cycle we will make a more realistic action plan, but also now we know what should be done to really make the change, as we said, because you might train the teachers, you might bring intercultural classes and bring kids together, but then if at home or if the dominant public or sub-public discourse is still ethno-nationalistic, then this is fake. When it will come for them to show diversity balanced attitude, they might skip it in their everyday life. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alojuzovsky. First of all, we once again very much appreciate our excellent cooperation, and we're glad as an institution to be able to provide support also as you go forward in developing and thinking about the next cycle of the policy. This is very important. Another element, and which is why I'm grateful for your reflections, as an institution, we have the thematic guidelines and recommendations. It is important for us to see how these thematic guidelines and recommendations are being implemented, and what is the feedback that we received from the governments, which we will then loop back into our thinking and our deliberations. So from that point of view, your views as practitioners are very, very valuable to us. So thank you very much. Dr. Fernand de Varenne earlier in the session gave us a flavor of multilingualism. So in that spirit, I will transition into Russian, and you all have headsets on your chairs. Следующий вопрос, госпожа Джусубекова, я бы хотел адресовать вам. Один из принципов, который в принципе прослеживается по многому количеству тематических рекомендаций Офиса Верховного комиссара по делам национальных меньшинств и присутствует в том числе и в люблянских рекомендациях, заключается в важности или необходимости соблюдения баланса между защитой языков национальных меньшинств, с одной стороны, а с другой стороны, соответственно, продвижение государственного или официальных языков, поскольку это представляется одним из эффективных инструментов интеграции разнообразных сообществ. Кыргызстан, начиная с 2008 года, активно участвует в Центральноазиатской образовательной программе. С этой точки зрения я хотел бы попросить вас прорефлексировать относительно опыта Кыргызстана с точки зрения соблюдения этого самого баланса.
Спасибо большое за вопрос. Уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемые организаторы этой конференции, разрешите вас поблагодарить и Министерство иностранных дел Словении, Верховного комиссара за то, что были столько усилий, чтобы я смогла попасть на эту конференцию. Спасибо большое. И позвольте вас ознакомить с нашим таким, я думаю, что богатым опытом по внедрению многоязычного образования. Для сохранения баланса между родными языками и государственным языком, я думаю, что для нашей страны это было большой удачей именно найти вот этот механизм многоязычное образование. Внедрение многоязычного образования является частью политики интеграции в Кыргызской Республике, позволяет избежать культурной и экономической изоляции, способствует сохранению родных языков, наряду с качественным освоением государственного, официального и иностранного языков. Данный подход, с одной стороны, позволяет удовлетворять базовые права граждан на получение качественного образования, а с другой снижает риски, связанные с недостаточным знанием государственного языка, обеспечивает конкурентоспособность выпускников на рынке труда. Задачи развития многоязычного образования в качестве приоритетных отражены в таких национальных документах, как Национальная стратегия развития Кыргызской Республики с 2018 по 2040 годы. Концепция развития гражданской идентичности кыргыз-джараны в Кыргызской Республике на период до 2026 года. Программа развития государственного языка и совершенствования языковой политики в Кыргызской Республике до 2025 года. И я считаю, что, на мой взгляд, самый еще такой важный документ, это сейчас, на данный момент, мы перерабатываем закон об образовании, и именно в законе об образовании включены очень важные такие понятия, само понятие многоязычного образования, и еще важнее это возможность для каждого гражданина обучаться на родном языке, то есть сохранение родных языков. Основные принципы и подходы реализации многоязычного образования в Кыргызской Республике определены в концепции поликультурного и многоязычного образования в Кыргызской Республике и программе внедрения поликультурного и многоязычного образования в Кыргызской Республике, которые тоже в настоящий момент обновляются. Обновленный государственный образовательный стандарт общего школьного образования также предусматривает возможность и необходимость реализации многоязычного образования. Ну и я хотела бы о хорошей такой новости еще сообщить, что с Министерством финансов Кыргызской Республики в настоящее время достигнута такая серьезная договоренность, и мы можем принять национальную программу многоязычного образования, где финансирование будет поэтапно выделяться, а это очень важно. Без финансирования нет успешности реализации никакой национальной программы. Это такая вот важная новость для нас. И еще хотела бы сказать для экспертов, что предметные образовательные стандарты по вторым языкам, по родным языкам у нас приняты. И самое еще интересное такое новшество для экспертов в образовании, что у нас в государственном образовательном стандарте общего школьного образования приняты уровни владения языками. То есть мы в конце начальной школы, то есть это у нас пока 4 классы, и в конце обучения в 9 классах, и на выходе мы будем измерять уровень владения языками. То есть на каком уровне, начиная от элементарного и, естественно, до C1, я надеюсь, носители даже дойдут, может быть, до совершенства, до C2. То есть это тоже очень важный подход для того, чтобы мотивировать и детей, и учителей, и родителей. Реализация многоязычных программ базируется на КЛИЛе, этот метод, который сохраняет ресурсы. То есть не нужно вводить слишком много часов на языковые предметы, а можно обучать предметы на целевых языках. Ну, наши эксперты понимают этот подход, и я думаю, что это правильный путь для Кыргызстана. Можно успешно обучать детей не только тем, чтобы они овладели в совершенстве своими родными языками, но также могли владеть и государственным языком, и иностранными языками тоже. Это все, что делается в Кыргызстане, было бы неуспешно, если бы мы не думали об устойчивости, если бы у нас институционально не закреплялось внедрение многоязычного образования. Есть в Кыргызстане в самом Министерстве образования сектор госязыка, который официально занимается многоязычным образованием. Есть у нас Центр инновационных технологий по повышению квалификации учителей языков, родных языков, вторых языков, иностранных языков при Министерстве образования. Также в Кыргызской академии образования, которая, кстати, занимается содержанием образования в республике, создан Центр многоязычного, непрерывного и инклюзивного образования. То есть вот эти все институты, они позволяют обеспечить устойчивость, если даже в какой-то период наши доноры не смогут нам оказывать какую-то поддержку, то есть мы все время думаем об устойчивости. Ну, естественно, не могу сказать не сказать про Центр социальной интеграции, реализующий соответствующие проекты в ИКНМ ОБСЕ. Апробация программ многоязычного образования успешно проходит начинается с детских садов. В детском саду такой метод, как языковое погружение, дает свои положительные такие плоды. 72 детских сада на сегодняшний момент успешно апробируют программу многоязычного образования. И мы получаем ежедневно огромное количество заявок от детских садов, которые хотят вступить в наши программы. Но вы понимаете, что одного желания вступить в эту программу мало. Нам нужно еще оценку ресурсов, уровень владения языками учителей, уровень владения языками даже не только вот педагогов в детских садах, но даже вспомогательного персонала. То есть это очень важно. Также более 80 школ на данный момент успешно апробируют эти программы. И мы тоже также ежедневно получаем огромное количество заявок школ, которые хотят вступить, но там тоже идет подготовительный такой период, чтобы они могли вступить в эти программы. И я бы хотела очень кратко о том, какой механизм внедрения многоязычного образования. Основные подходы на уровне школьного образования – это используется 2 или 3 языка для преподавания предметов, помимо уроков языка. Предметы могут полностью вестись на целевом языке или для проведения урока используются 2 языка. Например, изучение нового материала на родном языке, а повторение уже на целевом языке. В классе с кыргызским языком обучения математика и физкультура, например, ведутся на русском языке, химия на английском, остальные на кыргызском. В классе с русским языком обучения родиноведение, физкультура проводится на кыргызском языке, остальные на русском. В классах с узбекским языком обучения математика и химия проводятся с использованием кыргызского языка, физкультура и биология на русском, остальные на узбекском. Создаются условия для ежедневной практики использования целевого языка или языков. Практически вся работа в школе реализуется в рамках действующих учебных программ. Важно изменение роли учителя как организатора коммуникативных ситуаций, создание доброжелательной и поддерживающей обучающей среды, широко используются стратегии поддержки учащегося, языковые конструкции, многоязычные словари, визуальная поддержка. И мне хотелось бы на результатах все-таки апробация – это главным образом достичь конкретных таких успехов для того, чтобы страна могла принять самое серьезное управленческое решение. То есть правильно ли мы сделали, что во всех стратегических документах заложили многоязычное образование как механизм интеграции всего общества. И поэтому, естественно, мы всегда проводим системный мониторинг, постоянно анализируем. Результаты внедрения многоязычного образования в школах. Качество владения целевым языком в пилотных классах повышается от 20 до 40%. Особенно активно развиваются навыки говорения и аудирования. Для оценки результатов языкового обучения используются инструменты сравнимой и объективной оценки всех языковых навыков на основе уровневого подхода. В пилотных классах среди учащихся заметно вырос интерес к учебе и изменилось отношение к своему будущему. Непосредственные участники проекта, учителя и дети, демонстрируют большую открытость и социальную вовлеченность. Среди учителей значительно выросла заинтересованность в профессиональном росте и возможностях развития. И я бы хотела в конце тоже поделиться с вами очень хорошей новостью, что именно после апробации программы многоязычного образования у нас дети узбекоязычных школ, таджикоязычных школ, они стали успешнее сдавать ОРТ. Ну это что такое? Это общереспубликанское тестирование, это механизм, на основе которого наши выпускники, наши дети зачисляются в высшие учебные заведения. Если до программы многоязычного образования именно выпускники узбекоязычных и таджикоязычных школ были менее успешны, и они не могли попадать в высшие учебные заведения, то после программ, естественно, после апробации этих программ у нас наши дети стали более успешными, и они стали поступать в высшие учебные заведения в том числе. И, естественно, без методических материалов, без серьезных ресурсов достичь успехов в многоязычном образовании очень сложно. Но я не буду вас докучать и все разработанные нами методические материалы не буду озвучивать. Их можно на нашем сайте edu-resource.net посмотреть. Очень интересные методические материалы. И естественно, в конце выступления я бы хотела сказать о комплексности подхода. Если бы не было у нас в Кыргызстане комплексного подхода, то, естественно, успехов во внедрении многоязычного образования просто не было бы. Это и детские сады, это и школы, это и колледжи, и вузы. И только вот при таком подходе, конечно, возможен успех. И очень кратко. Мы разработали подходы по подготовке педагогов для многоязычных школ и включили следующие направления. Специализация на уровне бакалавриата. В рамках существующей программы вводятся изменения в части психолого-педагогического и методического блоков по вопросам интегрированного обучения предмету языку. Магистерская подготовка по направлению педагог программ многоязычного образования. Необходима разработка короткого магистерского курса, который позволит на базе имеющегося ранее педагогического образования получить подготовку для работы в программах многоязычного образования в дошкольных организациях, школе, вузе. Получение двойной специальности. Преподаватель математики со знанием английского, русского, китайского и родных, что для нас очень важно, родных языков. И я думаю, что только благодаря комплексному подходу, благодаря нашим донорам, нашим партнерам, в данном случае ВКНМ ОБСЕ, их экспертной поддержки и помощи, серьезной помощи, я думаю, что Кыргызстан на верном пути. Ну, естественно, мы на этом не намерены останавливаться, мы намерены дальше двигаться. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо вам большое. Спасибо вам большое. Судя по тому количеству хороших новостей, которыми вы с нами поделились, мы действительно на правильном пути. Вы обозначили 3 ингредиента, которые для меня являются важными. И это как бы такой треугольник этих ингредиентов. Во-первых, с точки зрения эффективной политики интеграции существует необходимость в знаниях и в экспертизе, вы говорили о методических пособиях и так далее. Второй принцип, о котором мы говорили также в первой части нашего мероприятия, это наличие политического желания, собственно, поддерживать эти программы интеграции. Ну и третий элемент, который вы повторяли в рамках вашего выступления, это важность ресурсов. Важность ресурсов как человеческих, так и финансовых для того, чтобы, собственно, проводить и успешно осуществлять эту политику. Спасибо вам большое еще раз за ваши мысли. We, in addition to advising the OSCE participating states on effective integration policies as the Office of the High Commissioner to the authorities, as an office, we also function as a platform for different participating states to engage with each other and share the experiences with each other and share lessons learned with each other. Today we have North Macedonia with us, we have Kyrgyzstan, we also have Lithuania, joining us in our deliberations, and Lithuania has also been a reliable partner and ally for the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities when it comes to integration policies. I would like to turn to you, Dr. Montvidite, and I would like to go back to our first speaker, Dr. Jackson Priest, that reflected on integration processes being a process of mutual accommodation, where both majorities and minorities change as well. How do you see this principle reflected in integration policies in Lithuania? And importantly, because it's both majorities and minorities are expected to change as a result of integration policies, what are the reactions that you see among majorities and minorities in Lithuania?
Thank you. Thank you, Excellencies, Commissioners, for the possibility to be here. And thank you, Office advisors, inviting our country to share experience with audience. I will speak as a practitioner about what we are doing and how diversity in reality goes in our country. And Ljubljana guidelines is constantly on my table, and I thought, and I'm sure that not only me am using it in Lithuania, but journalists, politicians, academic people. Why this book is so tall? Ljubljana guidelines are not so tall document, and because we translated all guidelines and recommendations into Lithuanian language. To have document in native language and helps use it more often in our everyday life. And I would like once more to thank team of people who worked, which produced this very comprehensive handbook, textbook for people in public sector, especially working on national minority issues. As I was asked to speak about majority-minority percentage and work and the reactions what are. Many times I speak, and it's already somewhere written that this policy is two-way, the two-street traffic. What we are doing in our country, we are sure that the traffic line society towards minorities should be more wide, should be more intense, because it's us society responsible to know better, to understand minority groups. They do not have to prove that they exist, that they have rights. It's our duty of society people. People are working in public administration especially, to know better, to know more deeply about different linguistic ethnic groups living in our country. And when our department was reestablished, Department of National Minorities under the government of Lithuania, I received many times question why minorities need a specific institution. Why they are so privileged, and all the time my answer was, no, not minorities need specific department. It's us, society, the whole country, state needs such institution to have. We are privileged that we have such. And the biggest part of our job, as I already mentioned, is to make society more familiar of minorities' history, cultural heritage, and time to time appears, it was not before, that confessional question, religious question becomes more and more important in these days. We have very interesting practice, maybe it could be interesting for other practitioners in other countries. Our parliament each year dedicates for various historic personalities or events, specific year dedicated, and already some years we have practiced that one of national minority receives the status. For example, last year it was Tatar History Year in Lithuania, 700 of Tatars history in Lithuania. This year is Karaitis community. We have very small specific Karaitis minority, which are less than 200 people. But at this year, when it's announced as a specific program, many financing programs, media attention goes to this specific group, and it helps society to know more about maybe not in every day noticed specific minority group. Even touristic routes, culinary, some routes are organized in this year to know better one minority. Another one interesting example I would like to share. With history academicians in history sciences, we prepared very interesting material, teaching material. In every country it could be done. Just change the name. Lithuania Created Together. And it's material in different topics, religious, literature, culinary, could be participation in fights for freedom. And all the time when we are presenting this exhibition, it's in digital forms, it's in sheets like this, in even book we have with this material. All the time we appear in different audiences saying not only Lithuanians, not only big communities, every community which lives in our country for centuries, for decades, we all created country what we have now. And it's still interesting. I'm traveling in the country for maybe 3 years with this exhibition, and still people are coming, listening, and on Thursday I will have in Prime Minister's office, as government changes, people are coming new and new, and all the time I see people who are surprised to see how many nations live in Lithuania. We have specific awards for journalists, for scientists who choose to speak about and investigate, research national minority question. But as I have so small time, little left, I would like to speak a little bit about the other part of this national minority street with 2 lines, about line minority to society. And one interesting phenomenon noticed maybe 2-3 years ago, that very successful are initiatives where minority works with minorities. They feel more comfortable to speak to each other. They show big respect and honor while attending each other's meetings, and they could make some how to say, lobbyistic maybe movements, to participate in political activities, to get promoted, to speak not from one minority groups, but then they merge their efforts. It's much more convenient, and it becomes more and more important for us in our department to help minorities to get organized together and in more organized collective groups to present themselves. And in the finalizing remarks, I am very happy that already heard from previous experts suggestions what I would like to suggest to Office of Commissioner, to advisors maybe for next meetings, to speak about statistic, about relevant data. Some colleagues today were optimistic, some were pessimists, but I think we should stay realists. And to be realistic in creating effective national minority policies in all countries in EU, we have to use very reliable statistics, figures, because our topic we all know in every country could be used by politicians just to make waves in society. When I was a younger director, all the time I almost cried when journalists or some minority leaders said, situations for minorities is getting worse and worse. Or some were saying better and better and nowhere better. And now I already know, I started to ask questions. Please give figures. What do you mean, worse and worse? What was 2 years ago, what we have now? But for this, we have to monitor processes, and it needs good finances, good scientific teams to have. We, for example, have prepared with scientists good methodology about discrimination, anti-discrimination, national minorities in labor market. But it's only methodology, very interesting methodology. In other meetings I would like, if would be possibility to share, but to use methodology, to do monitorings every 2, every 3 years. It is an expensive tool, but maybe uniting efforts, uniting our human resources in different countries, we could do manageable so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Montvidaite. Thank you for sharing your considerations and for making an important point indeed that you've concluded with towards the end of your contribution, that any effective policy, including effective diversity governance related policy, needs to be rooted in evidence, needs to be rooted in data. And we know from our experience that especially identity related data can easily be politicized. It can be politicized in various facets. It could also be politicized as part of the census, identity-related data collection and use. And as an Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, we, from time to time, with advisors, we get together to reflect on what would be the most effective ways of depoliticizing identity-related data collection and use, and this is the advice that also features in the High Commissioner's dialogue and High Commissioner's conversations with the OSCE participating states. So thank you for making that important observation. Dr. Palermo, we have almost concluded the panel. We are now turning to you for your wisdom in terms of looking forward. Dr. Rother identified 5 challenges and 5 lessons learned in relation to those challenges that we've extracted from the past 10 years of implementing the Ljubljana guidelines. Could you please take us into the future? Let's say we get together, maybe likely here, in 10 years, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Ljubljana guidelines. From that point of view, what would be the things that you would advise we take into consideration going forward?
Well, thank you, Zaid, and thanks for the invitation. Also, thanks for the easy question, like to predict the future. And I just hope you're not going to quote me in 10 years, say how wrong this guy was back then. But, a lot has been said already. I would like to start by the words of Ambassador Volebek, who, despite the difficult times, has been able to spread a message of optimism, right? And he actually is an optimist. Quoting Gandhi and saying that the future depends on what we do today, right? We also know that today is yesterday's future. And the current troubles we are having depend on what we did or what we didn't actually yesterday. So it's a little bit like, I think you mentioned that, like the climate change. Yeah? We are all aware of the problems that we are going to face, but in a way it is kind of difficult to act. So what should we learn actually from what we haven't learned from the past 10 years. I think, well, a lot has been already said. I just want to focus on a few spotlights, really. What we really need to learn for the next 10 years in order not to be complaining too much in 10 years' time that Ljubljana guidelines are such a wonderful document, but is kind of useless because it has not been applied. I think we can focus on a few lessons that we should look at differently in the next 10 years. The first one is that we should stop looking for excuses, to be honest. Initially, the lack of good measures to help societies integrate better was the fact that there was a lack of norms. So no, there are no norms, so we cannot act properly. Then the second stage was, after the norms have been adopted, well, there is a lack of policies. The norms are out there, but there are no policies implementing them. Then policies, as we have also heard, have been implemented more or less thoroughly. And then the next excuse was, oh, there is a lack of indicators and data on how to measure them. And this is also no longer true. I mean, I have brought here just the first front page of a thick book, which is called Handbook on Diversity and Inclusion Indices. You might be familiar with the book, and there are so many different indexes and measurements that we have actually no excuse. As Vela has said, okay, they are mostly targeting migrants, but after all, the instruments are all the same. I don't want to disclose a big secret, but in terms of instruments, I mean, despite the fact that the target groups might be different, the instruments are not that different anymore. So what will be the next excuse? I hope it's not the lack of political will. Of course, political will is always lacking, but it is really about trying to find ways to promote political will and to promote awareness of the fact that without the will to counter issues, then we are going to have problems. And this is at the heart of the mandate of you, High Commissioner, right? So the second big point is that actually we haven't learned, but others have said that already, the main message of the Ljubljana guidelines, that we should look at what and not at who. If we start dividing society into segments and then pretend that we can kind of accommodate them and think in terms of homogeneous groups accommodating or sometimes clashing with other homogeneous group, then we are certainly on the wrong way, and that there is nothing worse for a therapy than being based on the wrong diagnosis. And the wrong diagnosis is to, prospect a society which is not existent. A society of homogeneous groups, of people having all the same claims. That's not the case. And we have already heard about intersectionality and the challenges of the future. So we should accept that societies are complex. They are, as was said, marble cakes and not layer cakes. But this goes not only for majorities. This also goes for minorities. And the idea of minorities may be out of fear, which is perfectly understandable. To claim that they are homogeneous and never changing is also not helping minority groups either. To see things like this is really a recipe for conflicts. And we've seen what has happened over the past 10 years, and I'm afraid it can continue for the next 10 years if we are not countering that. Many examples have been given. Also, Knut Vollebeck mentioned some. Also, the idea of reorganizing departments and having people responsible for different segments of societies talk to each other would be certainly a good step. And generally to raise awareness, if there is a problem with the Ljubljana guidelines, is that they are not enough known. It's good to know that they are actually always on your desk, but this is not, unfortunately, the case everywhere. And so a better promotion of what they really mean could help us further. The third point is that diversity not only will grow, as you said, Zahid, but it is irreversible. Like it or not, it is irreversible. It happens. So how can we avoid conflicts? By managing the diversity which is growing instead of selling recipes that are not applicable. The fact that societies can return to a supposedly homogeneous ideal world, which has probably never existed, but certainly is not going to exist in future. There are internal factors for that, the intersectionality that we have mentioned. There are external factors, right? Conflicts, climate change, countries that need workers, and it can go on for hours. Countering that, trying to combat that sort of development creates further conflicts, doesn't help integration. So the only way we have is to better manage these changes. Because, as I said, good therapies need to be based on good diagnosis, and I'm afraid in many cases diagnoses are wrong. And the last point, maybe, perhaps even from a lawyer's perspective, the most important one. So what areas of the Ljubljana guidelines should be looked at more closely to avoid these problems in 10 years? Well, all, of course. It is a comprehensive document, and many very important ones have been already mentioned: the rule of law, the autonomy arrangements, the symbols and language, all things that are important and perhaps can be further explored. But if I have to pick one, I would say participation. Because participation is the basis for all the rest. So in order to avoid a top-down imposition of identities, I tell you what you are, you represent an homogeneous group, you are to be integrated into the mainstream society, and all the things that we have been discussing for the past couple of years, of days, there is only one way out, which is a procedural framework, a neutral framework where everyone can present claims, where identities can also change and claims can also change over time. As I think it was Petra saying, it is also contextual, right? You can have a claim in one moment and a different claim a few years later, because circumstances have changed. And so we need to have this framework where this can be expressed, to express internal identities of groups and to enter a structured dialogue with the decision makers. And this is very, very important. And you don't know the outcome, but at least to have the good starting point can help a lot. And to also conclude on a positive message and a positive note, I think the High Commissioner is best suited for helping with that. High Commissioner has a wonderful advantage and also a sort of a big problem in a way, which is it becomes relevant when times are difficult. And this is a time where the High Commissioner is probably more needed than ever. And it can help provide this good advice. So we have probably lost the past 10 years, and the hope is that we are not going to lose the next 10 years. Thank you so much.
Very much, Dr. Palermo. You've started with optimism, you've concluded with optimism, so I think we will continue maintaining that spirit. You have given us several valuable points. Our advisors, my colleagues, have been diligently taking notes of your contribution, and please rest assured that when we get together in 10 years, we will definitely quote you and then assess your forecast in relation to its accuracy. But something tells me that most of it will be accurate, for better or for worse, but we will definitely continue working in the direction of our common purpose of integrating diverse societies. I'm looking at, and we are at 12:59, and I am facing a difficult choice of whether or not we open the floor for questions or remarks, or whether we use an opportunity of lunch reception as a way to engage with each other and ask our wonderful distinguished experts for their advice and contribution. And I think I am leaning towards the latter, because that will be an organic continuation of our very interesting conversation up to this point. On this, let me thank our distinguished experts, practitioners, for your reflections, for your very valuable contribution and advice. We will definitely process it, and then we will be coming back to you to continue our very good collaboration. Please now let's thank our distinguished panelists for their contributions with a round of applause. And as we have reached the end of the conference today, may I please invite High Commissioner Abdurrahmanov for the concluding remarks. High Commissioner.
Well, in fact, I am in favor of your first option offered, because I'm myself personally so much inspired by what has been delivered this morning until this early afternoon. So, and I encourage you to take a chance to talk to distinguished speakers as well as to my team. In fact, probably quite a significant number of the HCNM office today is here in Bordeaux. This is such a popular destination, and now we witnessing its beauty. But on the other side, probably this is a place which is going to kick off a new process of revisiting some of our acquis. And that's why I'm so thankful to all of you for your presence. And the matter is so important for us because we are not just looking at the past, we are not just taking stock of our experience, we are not just simply identifying challenges and analyzing them via prism of contemporary needs and requirements and expectations on behalf of the OEC participating states. But on the other side, I'm thinking about the future of the OEC, the future of our organization, and as those who are not so much familiar with our organization, I want just to remind you that we have four such a distinguished institutions, as it was mentioned, autonomous, independent, out of any kind of pressure, any kind of manipulations with our in our activity. I myself, as a High Commissioner, never had any kind of pressure on behalf of any single participating states, and I really value such an attitude to us. But on the other side, and four institutions, these are obviously Secretariat, led by Honorable Secretary General, Madam Helga Schmid. Her name is quite widely probably known. Not less renowned the other institution, ODIHR, which is famous not only for observing of elections, but many other accomplishments. Representative on freedom of the media, and your obedient servant who is in front of you with my team. So that's why I am grateful to all participants for such active engagement this morning to the promotion of the Ljubljana guidelines, as well as to the promotion of norms and principles of my beloved Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And now we understand that Ljubljana guidelines as relevant as never before in the light of so many challenges and, sad to say, to threats, and some of them being today highlighted. And I believe that today we had a sort of, brainstorming. And brainstorming is important also for my team. We are going now to together with your assistance, with the assistance of distinguished experts as well as of participating states, to think to consider various options how we could accommodate properly the potential of such institution as HCNM. By the way, this year is the 30th anniversary of establishment of HCNM, but next year is the 30th anniversary of establishing its office in The Hague. So all these are anniversaries, but we are not just simply going to celebrate this momentum, but also to commemorate and to mark these days in order to understand how much relevant is OSCE in today's security architecture. And Ljubljana guidelines to that end is the most comprehensive document produced by High Commissioners, in our particular case by my dear friend Knut Vollebæk. And this document encompassing, in fact, the broad theme of integration of diverse societies. And I said some of these documents been mentioned. It's about, as I said also in my introductory remarks, about linguistic rights, about education, it's about access to justice, about mass media in digital era, it's kin-state relations, and policing in multi-ethnic society and some other themes. And all of them are quite, in our particular case, all these themes are heavily saturated in Ljubljana guidelines. I'm thankful to participants for sharing their, best practices and good examples. And I'm also thankful to you for some gifts delivered this morning and early afternoon. And when I'm talking about gifts, you just learned from, for example, my distinguished friend and literally sister from Kyrgyzstan, that their government, providing quite sufficient budget for implementation of multilingual education. Because financing is one of, financing for development. Probably this is one of priorities for Slovenian campaign for United Nations Security Council. I wish you best of success in all these endeavors. Finally, we are talking about, some meaningful resources for implementation. We have, best ever practices in many countries. I'm really very much impressed from my recent visits, for example, to Central Asia, before the Caucasus, in particular, Georgia, southeastern countries. I visited all of them and learning from their best examples. Some of, even today there were some maybe pessimistic notes with regard not only of implementation, but of legislative framework existing in some of participating states. But I'm much more probably optimistic. I feel how positive is political atmosphere around issues related to national minorities. Believe me, it's it's so important. All heads of state or government, speakers of parliament, and politicians who I meet, all of them expressing, sort of their strive to improve the situation with their national communities, minorities. You can use any, word to that end. And for this, I'm thankful to all of them. But on the other side, and this is my message, in fact, to politicians, I call on politicians to be resilient before various kind of temptations or sometimes even pressure they have experiencing on behalf of various camps, political camps, lefts, rights, nationalists, traditionalists, conservatives, and others. Politicians should be resilient, they should be really visionary, and to provide this visionary leadership to their nations. So, and I hope very much that this kind of my message will be received in very much in positive way. By the way, special thanks go also to some to the young generation. I also mentioned in my introductory remarks that we appreciate presence of young people here. Some of them representing some of them are diplomats, some of them are from academia. There are some students, I believe, so among us. I wish them to inherit from us, from this generation, all these values which we all striving for. I learned a wonderful Slovenian proverb during my visit, which say, "Več glav, več ve." So many heads, no more. So indeed, together with all of you, we have today expanded the breadth of our knowledge and deepened our understanding of important issues related to integration of diverse society. I think that the vocabulary of above-mentioned young people now expanding dramatically. I am grateful to all of you for your dedication to respecting this diversity, recognizing its value in building cohesive and resilient societies. I want to again to thank our partners, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia, for their exceptional cooperation and coordination of this event. My many thanks to my devoted HCNM team for their commitment and tireless efforts in organizing this event. I appreciate the contribution of our distinguished interpreters. And at the same time, I want, just according to my tradition, to test the ground to how much this audience, I mean international audience, is familiar with Slovenia. Please, I want just distinguished Slovenians, honorable citizens of Slovenia, not to respond quickly. Who is Mr. Roglic? Please, who knows? This is my just. Who is Mr. Roglic? Come on. This is just sad. Okay, but who is Mr. Pogacar?
No sports fans?
So, well, it's. By the way, this. Are they from the same team, Jumbo Visma? No. From different team. Yeah, they are in different team. I mean, well, why I'm mentioning, because this, now they will start. I mean, who is from Spain? Well, Vuelta of Spain now is going on. And now Mr. Roglic, Primož Roglic, his task is to reduce a gap. He is on second place at Vuelta, and only few stages left for him. So in his name, in the name of Mr. Roglic, I wish the best of success to Slovenia. By the way, a team which Mr. Roglic is representing is also quite diverse by representation. It's an international team where Norwegian is there, some Norwegians, representatives of Germany, of the United States, of Australia, obviously of Italy, are present in this team. So this is a chance for me also to express how passionate I am also towards Slovenia and its such undisputable achievements, not only in sports, but also in many other spheres. So our international team, which in front of you, on behalf of the HCNM office, are so thankful to all of you for joining us today. And please, I encourage you to continue meeting and talking to us during the lunch. Before I will invite Zahid to announce some housekeeping guidelines. So may I take this opportunity on behalf of all of you to thank distinguished Zahid Mavlazada, my our master of ceremony, for his excellent moderation. So looking forward to see you during the lunch. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. Thank you kindly. Just a couple of technical points. First, the bus back to Ljubljana departs from the conference center at 3:30. That's the first point. The second point, and my colleagues are instructing me on how to instruct you in terms of the directions to lunch at Duck Island, which reads as follows. To the right,